We have a panel discussion and with a Q&A session all about measuring engineering performance. Now, before we begin, I have to just announce that Johnny Ray Austin isn't going to be part of the panel discussion today, but I'm going to announce, obviously, our four members who are going to be here. So we've got Peter Buckingham, Director R&D at VMware, Bela Labovitch, who's Vice President of Engineering at athenaHealth, Devon North, who's a Transformation Director, and our session is going to be moderated by Georgina Owens, who's Chief Product and Technology Officer at LifesBackup. The panel will be looking at why measuring performance is necessary and the best practices to ensure it isn't just for measurement's sake. It's about understanding what to monitor and why including metrics, observability, information radiators, and retrospectives and continuous improvement is fundamentally important. So guys, have a great panel discussion and over to you.
Hello, good evening, everybody, and thank you for welcoming us here to this panel. So I am Georgina Owens, as Giles introduced, and I'll be moderating the panel today. Now, the best panels and most lively panels are the ones where we get lots and lots of audience participation. So please do submit questions as we go through, and we will certainly be monitoring those and looking to incorporate your questions into the panel. Now, to kick off, we'll get everybody to introduce themselves, and we're going to start off with a bit of a quick-fire question as well. And so my quick-fire question to everybody is going to be, to measure or not to measure, what is your opinion? So let's start, Devon, with you.
Thanks, Georgina. So I think, yes, we should measure. And just a bit of background about myself. Technology director. I've worked across media, retail, finance, motor and utilities. I focus on where companies can gain understanding and drive business focus using data. And also I work with companies to get their vision, their strategy, and to build roadmaps to deliver against and often scale against. But yeah, yes, I think we should measure.
Great, thank you. Peter, good evening. Or good morning.
Hi, it's good morning over here. So I'm Peter Buckingham. As you know, I'm the director at VMware. I lead the AI and ML development for the core virtualization platform at VMware. And I came into VMware as part of an acquisition. So I was the VP of engineering at Bitfusion, which is a technology for virtualizing AI accelerators. And prior to that, I was CTO at a different startup, Waypoint, which does SaaS analytics for commercial real estate and workflow. But I also have a long history of working at small and large companies, including NVIDIA and Sun. To measure or not to measure, that is the question. So it should be no surprise that I think, yes, we should measure, since I'm here talking on this panel, and we'll get into that a lot more, I guess, as we chat.
Great, looking forward to that. Thank you. Bela.
Hi, so I'm Bela Labovitch, and I'm a VP of Engineering at athenaHealth. athenaHealth provides us cloud-based software for providers' offices and health systems. I've played various roles of CTO, head of engineering, architect, and developer through my career journey. And I'm passionate about creating high-performing teams and bringing more women to technology. So you can't improve what you don't measure. So I am actually a big believer in metrics, and I use them a lot. I've used them a lot through my career. So yes.
Great. Can't wait to hear more about that. So thank you very much. Okay, let's go to our first question. And the first question that I'm going to ask, I'm going to pose to Devon. And that question is, do you think we should use metrics to hold teams accountable?
Thanks, Georgina. I think accountable is a strong word. However, at the end of the day, teams are working for companies that need to make money. They need to produce things in order to deliver to customers. And in most other industries, you would be accountable for showing what you've done and showing that you're in progress. So they should be measured, they should be accountable to be measured, but also I think the whole team, it expands beyond just maybe the engineering teams, it's the product, it's the stakeholder. They should all form part of any of those measures.
That's a good answer. Thank you. And you're right. Accountable is a strong word and can be taken very negatively. I think we as technology leaders have a duty to make it positive and put it across in a positive way. Peter, Bela, does either of you have a view on that?
Sorry, I was just going to chime in because I think the measurability is important, but just because something is measurable doesn't mean that we should do it, right? So a classic thing that people used to measure is lines of code or bug fixes per day, or so sometimes I think the engineering team gets short shrift because it's easy to measure a lot of the output, whereas the other teams that have inputs into engineering don't get held to the same standard. So I think accountability is important, but for a healthy organization, it's got to be across teams. So I mentioned this, I think, earlier when we're chatting, but the product team, it needs to be held accountable for providing good requirements into the engineering team. And if things change whilst you're actively developing, it shouldn't be a surprise that has an impact to the outcome and also to these metrics.
So end-to-end accountability.
Yeah.
Great. And I'd agree. I'd agree definitely to highlight any of the challenges that you might get maybe between product and customer, maybe not delivering requirements or changing requirements. It's the measures really to look at the whole team end to end.
Yeah, so I'll be the contrarian here because I believe in self-accountability. And I think it's more important to measure the metrics and then feed them to the teams and hope that the teams themselves will be motivated to be accountable. And I think sometimes just knowing someone's measuring something is enough motivation for a team to try to improve. So it's another view on metrics and accountability.
Yeah, I think self-accountability within end-to-end accountability, the key really is everybody understanding where they're dependent on other people in order to deliver successfully. And I guess that is a combination of the self-accountability and the end-to-end accountability. So Great, good start. So the next one that we're going to go to is around, what are the best metrics to deploy in an agile environment? And, how should that be different to any other environment? I think, Peter, you're going to kick us off on this one.
Yeah, so I had two contrasting thoughts on this, and I'll share sort of both of them quickly and we can discuss them. I mean, well, firstly, it kind of depends on what is it you're delivering. So when I was at Waypoint, we're delivering a SaaS platform. So we had a regular cadence of sort of CI/CD, pushing things out to support our customers. And, there are some interesting metrics. There's a book by Jez Humble and others called Accelerate that talks about, how often do you release, if you make mistakes, how quickly do you recover? And I think that they're good things to measure, particularly for SaaS companies, because that's how you deliver product. But the other thing I was sort of thinking about too is actually more to your point, Bela, earlier about individual aspects. So, DHH has a concept of sort of developer happiness he talks about. And so I think looking through what is the sort of cycle time that individual engineers have as part of their development process. One thing that I often look at when I join new organizations is how much effort does it take for a one line or a no line code change to take to get to production. And that gives you a pretty good indication about how your engineers will have to deal with sort of the process and the metrics that you have at your organization. Anyway, I'll pause there because I think there's probably enough to chat about with both of those comments.
Okay, who's going to jump in first?
I'd also like to bring in some of the measures that you need for the business. Some of the metrics around value and, how do we measure the success and the goals? So, bring in those areas as well.
I think we'll come to that. In an agile environment, is there anything specifically that you wanted to cover off around metrics and whether they're different to say, a non-agile?
Value for me should be part of an agile metric. We should always be building value, even if that value is to learn something or to get measures from. There always should be something that we're delivering in terms of value.
I guess I would debate that whatever the methodology is, value should be absolutely key when you're delivering.
So I think value to a certain extent comes down to, it's an input and an output, but I would say, value often is used in terms of deciding what to do, right? So if we develop this feature, we think it's going to have more value to the customers. And maybe what we're trying to do is measure that output is either maintaining constant or improving over time because of the output. There are some. So I sidestep some of the classic metrics that people look at in agile environments. So quite often people look at say velocity. So people will go as part of sprint planning. They'll do Scrum Poker, look at story points and throughput, and I found those sort of metrics to be problematic, at least just in isolation. And so I don't know whether you have had similar experiences, but just looking at velocity from a sprint to sprint perspective generally isn't so informative. I've typically found that looking at velocity trailing across, the preceding month or 6 weeks is more useful in terms of normalizing some of the noise.
Yeah, so I think trending across sprints is probably more useful. So Bela, did you want to jump in?
I did. Yeah, no, I agree with sort of story points, velocity. Certainly we track all those metrics, but the one metric that I find that really makes a difference to track and then actually set goals to try to meet is sprint completion average. Because what I've found in my career is teams sort of, they do their work and you get to the end of the sprint and you throw things over the wall and then you throw things over the wall and things don't start getting completed. And so actually setting a metric, we set it at the metric at 85% in our teams to say, try to at least complete 85% of what you set out to do on average. Try to get to 100%. And that really is helpful because it improves estimation. There's some level of accountability that it helps increase as well. I found that to be a real difference maker metric when it comes to agile metrics.
So that's great. So we've had a question in from Steve who says, what's your favorite metric? And I'm assuming, Bela, you're going to tell me that sprint completion average is going to be your favorite metric.
Yes, absolutely.
Peter, what's yours?
Well, I was dissing velocity a little bit, but I think velocity across sprints is certainly a key way I look at measuring productivity. So,
is that your favorite?
I guess I'm going with velocity.
Okay. Devon?
I think probably time in sprint, how long is something taken?
Great. Okay. So
you're actually going towards, and I meant to respond to Peter there. For those that haven't read the book Accelerate, I definitely enjoyed that book because that's really focused on measuring engineering performance. And one of the metrics, Devon, which you're talking about, is how long does it take from the time you start coding to actually delivering to production. And that is one of the measures, not necessarily an agile measure, but it's a measure that's sort of much discussed in terms of team productivity. So then I was going to respond to Peter in terms of velocity. I think the good thing about measuring velocity is if teams try to continue to improve and increase their velocities, another measure of just constant improvement. And so I find metrics really help teams to view sort of this continuous improvement, and that they're on. So velocity is one of those metrics.
And I guess, that is the success with metrics, is if you actually use them with the team and review and discuss and then use them to come up with continuous improvement. So metrics for the sake of metrics and producing a report to show to someone really isn't really very useful. So we've got a few more questions actually relating to the topics that we've discussed already, and I'm going to go to let's go to the question from Brett next. I think that's going to magically appear in the box. There we go. So how do you quantify value as a metric?
Devon. That feeds right in.
Who wants Bela? Go on, you go first. Bela.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that feeds right into sort of one of the questions that we discussed, Georgina, which is around measuring value. And it's a great question because delivering software doesn't just make a team good, right? It's about delivering the right software that has the right outcomes. And that's key to high performance, right? If a team's invested not only in the software they're developing, but also in the value of the software they're developing, that's a huge difference maker when it comes to high performance teams. And so value needs to be measured using metrics, right? So I would say that insisting that there's a metric to measure the value of whatever it is you're developing, and then establishing that baseline, establishing at that target and measuring along the way, I think is critical. And if you're sort of in the SaaS model, for example, you can measure your value at alpha and beta and use those feedback loops to see if you're actually delivering what you set out to deliver. And so one of the things that we use in my subdivision is actually we use OKRs, right, to help us measure value. So, for example, we write software for doctors' offices, right? And so one of our measures of value is the net promoter score of our users. So we look at the net promoter score of our users, and we have that high level metric, and then we'll break that down into metrics that teams can actually utilize. For example, our billers resubmit claims, zero paid claims that are not paid by the insurance companies. So the team, in most of these claims, there's only some small fraction of the claims where you can actually recover value. So the team that's using machine learning to help guide the billers into which claims to submit or not, we will establish a metric that we want to make sure that they recover an additional 10% of the dollars they might otherwise. And then we will continue to measure that metric. So the question is about quantifying value. I think you can attach to whatever it is most things you're doing, you can attach a value in terms of a metric, usually, and then sort of measure against it. And it's more of a business value, whether it's dollars or percentages of, or net promoter scores of your users. So we do that very actively. I think there's just huge value in doing that. And it really gets your dev teams particularly very invested in what they're doing.
I think that's great.
Sorry, Georgina.
I was just going to say there's one important point that Bela mentioned there, which was the feedback loop. So it's no good measuring value if you've not got any feedback loop that's built into the process. So go on, Peter.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. It depends a lot on the maturity of the product and the company too, right? So if you're pre-Series A and you're trying to find product market fit, you don't necessarily have that same customer feedback loop, so you have to look at doing things in other ways. And so to a certain extent, there's the the product management aspect of deciding what do we do when, and then you can couple that with what Devon mentioned earlier, which is well, how long does it take to get something out from concept to delivery? And so I think for much earlier stage companies, value is different things. I mean, it's a bit of a vague term, right? Because we could just measure, amount of revenue that the company gains, And that's certainly value, but it becomes hard to be accountable, within engineering directly to some of those items.
Yeah. Devon, you've been waiting patiently.
I agree. I agree with Bela and Peter. But value ideally comes either from the business, in your product, and then you help build into that value and deliver that value, whether it's to market, to your customers, or, as you say, to build metrics further. But you should really always be measuring value, because at some point we may have passed that point of any value. So say we're building something and it's taken a bit longer. We thought we were going to get a certain amount of value out of it. We've spent money, and actually there's that tipping point of we should have a look and say, well, actually it's probably not going to be valuable by the time we can get it to market if it's taking twice as long, and those sorts of things. So it's really understanding what the business value is and what the actual value of the team is delivering, whether or not they can get live and things like that.
Well, and you make a good point there, right? Where and you have to be in a very mature organization if you are able to actually have a look at what you're delivering and the value and the market. And if you can assess that the value you thought you were going to deliver, you've missed it, you've missed the opportunity, and then therefore you stop what you're doing and reevaluate. Yeah. I mean, that's a real sign of maturity in an organization, right? So I'm going to go on to OKRs next. They've already been mentioned. So, and when we had our kind of pre-planning for this session, we talked about OKRs and whether we feel like they're like Marmite, right? You like it or don't like it. And Marmite's a very British term. And so it's Vegemite for part of the world. And when I was talking to Bela, we were trying to come up with an equivalent for the US, and we decided that it's Trump. So you're either like it or don't like it. So how do you all feel about OKRs? Devon, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, so I've worked in lots of companies that have brought OKRs in, and there's it's sort of a middle ground for me. I think OKRs are really good if you can set up maybe team OKRs which align with goals. And it's okay that those OKRs change and iterate, because sometimes you might get 3 months into a year or whatever, and you'll find that actually this isn't working anymore, so change it. So as long as they're not fixed, and as long as they're not, just if they're not aligned with goals, I find them really difficult. And if they are just quite micro OKRs, I also find them quite challenging. But they should really be about us always performing as best we can and always making sure that we are delivering against our goals and really building learning and encouraging learning and things like that. So I'll always agree with OKRs to have them, but not necessarily some of the details around them.
Okay. I'm going to come back after we've been round and get some top tips from all of you on setting OKRs. So if you can think about that while I hear from Bela on OKRs.
Yes, the answer is yes. We use OKRs very successfully. I think important is to couple the OKRs with a discipline of constantly examining them month over month, making sure you're sort of striving towards them, reminding everyone what they're doing. And they can be very effective if done right, but they're difficult to get right. And we're still on that journey. Yes.
Peter? Are you there, Peter, or have you frozen? I think Peter might have frozen. So top tips then on setting OKRs, Bela. You said that you're on the journey. How are you getting on with that?
I think the tip, or the one thing I would say, is you find that metric, right, is part of your key result. What metric are you, where are you? Measure your baseline. Where are you? Where are you trying to get when it comes to value? And I would say that is a tip, and sometimes you don't know. And so the advantage of using OKRs is you start wondering, like, where am I? How am I doing now? And you actually dive into your data and figure out the metric to establish that baseline. So the tip is to combine them with sharp metrics.
Okay, good. Devon, do you have a top tip for us?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with Bela. And also I really like being transparent. So when I'm trying to build OKRs, get a group of you together, and socialize them, talk about them, and really try and build momentum as a group with the OKRs, because sometimes they can be really negatively accepted if we're not careful. So I just encourage people to build into the OKRs as a team.
Okay, we're going to go back to the questions. We have a question from Slobodan. If we can get that on the screen, that would be really good. And this is talking about tools. So what tools do you use for measurement, and how do you communicate importance? So
I've used things like Jira for some of our team measurements. Obviously, you can do a lot of reporting out of Jira. I've also used some background metrics that come out of Jira that you can take into other apps. So that's more sort of team level, and some of the other tools I've used. In terms of measurements, yeah, I mean, obviously there's always Excel spreadsheets, but that's not the friendliest of tools. I think I'll hand over to Bela.
Sure, I'll tell you exactly what we've done. So one of the things I've consistently done with my teams is to start out building a scorecard. And you get together with your leaders and you say what metrics are important to you. And so our scorecard right now, for example, is related to quality in terms of number of defects, number of customer-facing defects, number of operational issues, downtime. We measure a number of metrics. We also measure delivery, right, in terms of velocity, story points. I talked about that before, so team completion average. And so we built a scorecard. So for the first year, we actually got the metrics more manually. We would go to Jira and get the metrics, go to the database and get the metrics. There were a number of different places we got the metrics from. And then when we found that, and then the next thing we did was to examine that scorecard month over month and look at trends and see if it was actually valuable and what metrics we wanted to keep and what metrics we thought we really weren't using. And we have a larger team. So I have the metrics, you can filter. There's metrics at my subdivision level, which is our product. Metrics then at a zone level, which is a bunch of teams working together on a problem, and then at the team level. And then what we did this year is to actually automate. So most systems have APIs. So, you can use the Jira API. You can go against your database. You can go against Zendesk. And so we've now automated that scorecard. And I think what's really important there is to examine the metrics with your team month after month and make sure that if you have targets, you're improving, or if they look off, you're doing something. And then secondly, feed them to individual teams so that they can get motivated to improve themselves. So that's one tool we've used, one way we've done metrics. The other interesting thing we did this year is we went to an outside vendor. We went to Blue Optima, but there are a lot of other vendors out there. And what the vendor measured was two things, right? Was development performance and quality, or a measure of quality. So what they do is they take your source control and they munge all the data, and they used 23 different metrics to measure developer productivity. And we did not do this at the developer level very intentionally, but we did measure developer productivity at our engineering level. Now we have over 1,000 engineers, a lot of engineers. But the reason we did that was to tell us whether our teams were more or less productive working at home. And we found that they were actually as productive or more productive working at home. So that was a good indication to us when we make our decision coming up on what we want to do going forward. But so there are vendors out there. So the answer is you can build your own tool or you can go to a vendor.
That's really good.
Sorry.
No, really good, really good. So, hi, Peter.
Hi. My view on this is I think, Bela, you kind of nailed it, really. I mean, there's plenty of ways to kind of build these things together. I would encourage people to start simple, right? Because quite often I've seen that people make the mistake of going from almost nothing to going overboard, and then it becomes overwhelming, and then it becomes hard to move because you're looking at too many different things. And so it's a good idea to measure things, to have visibility, but decide initially on a couple of key areas that you want to see improvement, and then to gradually make those changes. And so Jira is probably a good place to start, because or at least the equivalent, where people are managing their bugs and managing their sprints, so they can see some of these metrics. And then, as you start to go wider and start to pull in, user metrics or support cases and things like that, then you can start building a dashboard like it sounds like you have, Bela.
Great. So we lost you for a little bit, and we were looking for some top tips on setting OKRs. I don't know if you've got anything you want to add.
So on that, again, it's a similar sort of story. I think that the goal is with OKRs is to try and make people more aware of what you're trying to do as an organization and as a company. And so generally the idea is fewer is better. And a good test of that is if you just go to one of your engineers, do they know what they are, right? And so I've implemented them at previous companies, and actually at VMware, we're in the process of moving from kind of an MBO process to an OKR process. And the goal of OKRs is to make them more intelligible from that perspective. And I think all of these things kind of feed into that. So the O about the OKRs is really about trying to drive something that is a huge stretch goal, strategically important. And a lot of the metrics that we're sort of discussing at the moment are sort of KKRs. And so I think making it meaningful to what your business is doing, but translating that into engineering. So, I mentioned earlier, if you're at the earlier stage of a company, maybe product iteration speed is important because you're trying to find the product market fit. Whereas if you're at a Series D or you're a public company, actually test escapes is a more useful metric. And so I think trying to decide what's relevant and what is meaningful for your business and how that translates to engineering is critical.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to come back to the size of the company because we've talked about it a couple of times, but I want to really move on now to talking about how can we or how should we use metrics as a measure of disruption of change? And Devon, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, so I really like this measure. So one of the things I always say to the teams, if I want to implement measures, which sometimes the teams aren't always a fan of because they suddenly think Big Brother's watching them, and they don't like that feeling. But actually, what's really important is what these metrics will often show, especially things like our sprints. It'll show that either where we get delays might be much further before things get to the sprints. We find information's missing. We've got maybe product owners that keep changing their minds, people that just want a meeting for no reason. And these meetings just build up. Engineers lose days at a time for disruptive behaviors. So these things can be very disruptive. And also, teams love it when someone just says, I've just got a 5-minute question, but it's right in the middle of when they're trying to do something. So I think these measures quite often show that disruptive behavior. And when you have to have a conversation with your product owners or your clients or your customer stakeholders, it's actually really good to have that information in front of you. Otherwise, it can become quite an emotional discussion where they just say, well, you keep disrupting me. And they say, no, we don't. So it's really useful, I think, to have that information, and those metrics really help support that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Peter, you're nodding your head here. So I think we've
Yeah,
got some...
so I absolutely, right? So engineers in general hate disruption, right? So you, Devon, you're commenting on getting into flow and things like that. But I think there are a couple of ways to sort of look at this, right? I think trying to make it measurable is important. So, you know, I think that there's this perception that software is easy and it's easy and it's free to change your mind. And we kind of need to, you know, disabuse that kind of view of the world, right? So change your mind does have consequences, and we need to make sure people are held accountable for when that happens. And so I think, you know, at least the entry into the process, you know, how do we clearly specify work that needs to be done? And, you know, at what point do we sort of, like, we shouldn't do work that's not necessary. At the same time, changing your mind when the engineer is 3/4 done is a very costly time to do it. And if we could have figured that out by showing some designs to customers a month before then, why didn't we do that, right? So there was a requirement I put on my product team in the past of saying, when something enters the sprint, it needs to be fully specified, right? So when it's a story, it needs to be fully specified and agreed upon. There's a certain level of detail that we need in the designs if it has a front-end implication and things like that. I think it's also critical. So you're talking about change as well. So you know, we as leaders need to be held accountable for doing things too. So maybe we've decided to change some process, and we should be able to look at these metrics to decide, have we had the desired effect or not the desired effect? So has the change decreased the bug rates? Have we increased velocity? Have we done these things that have a measurable benefit to the team? Or if we see actually these things are continue to be the same or be worse, then it is important that we hold ourselves accountable and we'll change appropriately too.
Good, thank you. Bela, do you have a view on this one?
Was the question, are metrics disruptive to teams?
No, should we use metrics to measure the disruption caused by change?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's always a good idea because it indicates to you whether the change was a good change or not. So the answer, Georgina, is absolutely yes. But the key to that is figuring out what you want to measure, and again, establishing that baseline.
Yeah,
and so that, one of the things we did recently was we had a huge reorganization, but before we did a cultural survey to establish some metrics on where teams were feeling and, you know, before the change of leadership. And then we've done a survey after, and we're measuring the difference to see if some of the changes, the change in leadership, the change in philosophy, the introduction of OKRs, what that has done to our dev teams. So absolutely, that is critical when you change, you know, or have a disruption.
And I guess depending on the organization, if you have a huge amount of unplanned change and you know you've constantly got unplanned change, then you allow that headroom in the sprint so that it's less it's less demotivating for the engineers.
Yeah.
And have any
or you change the way you work. If your business can't support sprints, you look at, is there a different way that we can work for now until we get into a rhythm that would support it properly? Because especially if you don't quite know as a company what you're doing, until you've got measures, until you've got something out there, then there can be quite an extensive period of change. So manage the change and actually protect that change and work with it. So it can show you information to support that.
Okay, we have a few more questions. The time has flown by. We have around about 6 minutes left. So this is a good one from Tom. We've already talked about one of the books that everybody likes, which is Accelerate. But what else? What are the other best books on measuring engineering? Just jump in.
I'm trying to think, but it's not often covered. A lot of books on engineering talk about how to build things as opposed to actually. So I think that there's some books on organizational structure, which are helpful. I think what would I say is part of a theme that we've all mentioned is it's about reinforcing the teams that we have. So I think Ben Horowitz, in his book, it's not specifically on engineering, it's called The Hard Things About Hard Things, talks about some of these items where organizational structure is about communication. And I think the metrics that we're discussing are a way to help evaluate that, right? So how are the best ways that we're working with teams and things like that. So I would look, I can't, other than Jess Humble's book, Accelerate, I wouldn't say there's a lot of things out there that I say, hey, this has the list of 17 things that you should measure and it's awesome, because there isn't a comprehensive answer to that question. It's kind of what works in your environment.
Okay, good. I'm going to go to a question from Kishore, which is a good one. When should you not use OKRs? If you think there is a time when you should not use OKRs. Anybody?
I think I would say not to use them if, for whatever reason, the feedback is negative for whatever experience. So if the teams are feeling negative about OKRs that have been set, then don't use them until you've discussed to work out why. I haven't been in a company where people don't want to use them, but they can sometimes need some iterations and changing a bit, because they can be a bit weird to start with if you haven't used them before. So yeah, that's what I'd suggest.
And I think that's a great answer. And it's not just OKRs, but it's all the things that we've been talking about through this panel is you have to gauge how the team are reacting and responding to the use of any kind of metric, right? And any kind of reporting.
Yeah.
Just quickly on that. I mean, I think when not to use them, I mean, often with these metrics like OKRs, that they're misused. So your OKR should not replace your project management and planning process. So if you have an OKR that's about delivering something next week, your OKR is likely wrong. So you should think about that they're trying to stretch, grow, and develop the team and measure that you're getting where you need to go. Not that you completed your sprint on time.
Yeah. So Bela, we lost you for a brief moment, but the question here is there a time when you should not use OKRs?
I think I was listening to the end of Peter's conversation, and I agree with him. Couple of things. One is you should probably do some OKR training so you actually understand what OKRs are. I think that's important. And then you want to use them for longer term kind of goals, not for something that you want to deliver quickly and just sprint towards. So those would be the two that come to mind right away.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to squeeze one more question in, and then I'm going to ask each of you for your top tip around metrics, or that you want to leave the audience with. So the last question is going to be from Catalin, which is, how do we shift from measuring individual performance to teams' performance? Do you have any tips on how to do that?
So I've done OKRs before at team level and individual level, and they work quite well. You agree your OKRs at a team, and they could be your Scrum teams, or they could be things like your engineering teams at a different level. So it doesn't have to just be your Scrum teams, but they can work quite well if you're trying to either change the way you're working or bring in new things. They can work quite well.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I'd kind of say it's about choosing the right metrics, right? So, I talked about velocity before. Bela talked about sprint completion targets. So there's obviously an individual component in all of these things. Just like team sports, it's important to, like the final scoreboard is a result of what everybody does. But there needs to be an effort to understand what is your individual accountability for getting that done, but also to try and get the team there. So I think it really comes down to choosing the right metrics that reinforce that we are looking at the team, not just the individual.
Yeah, love that. The team and the scoreboard. So Bela, your last thought from you, please.
Yeah, just one last thought is that Agile is about team performance, not individual performance. So certainly I echo what Peter says.
Okay, so that's it. We're out of time, and all I want to do is say thank you to all of you for a really lively panel and the contribution, and thank you to everybody for the questions.
Thanks, Georgina.
Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina. Thanks, everybody.